In 1973, the Arab nations and the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries placed an oil embargo on the United States due to their support of Israel in the Yom Kippur War. In response, the United States, led by Henry Kissinger and President Nixon, took a stand against OPEC by continuing to support Israel despite the panic that arose. Oil consumption in the United States was rising. Between 1945 and 1959, consumption grew by 80%, and it continued to grow. The motto of the time was "fill her up." In 1950, the United States was independent in meeting their oil requirements, but by 1973, the United States had become 35% dependent on foreign oil, and the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries was their largest source of foreign oil. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries was formed in the Baghdad Conference in 1960 and included Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. Their main objective was to coordinate and unify petroleum policies and to ensure a regular supply of petroleum to consumers and a steady income to producers. OPEC was responsible for 90% of international oil trade, and throughout the 1970s produced 2 times the amount of oil as the United States. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, recognized their power over oil in the 1970s and would use it as a political weapon in response to the U.S. support of Israel in the Yom Kippur War. The Zionist state, Israel, was created in 1948, with the United States being the first nation to recognize it as an independent state. It immediately created conflict between the Arab nations and the Zionist Israel. During the Six-Day War in 1967, Israel obtained the lands in the Sinai Desert and Golan Heights, while Egypt suffered an embarrassing loss. Wanting to reclaim the Sinai Peninsula and pride in their military, Egypt, with the support of Syrian forces, attacked Israel on October 6, 1973, the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur, surprising Israel and beginning the Yom Kippur War. Although Egypt and Syria were not part of OPEC, they had the support of Arab nations in control of the embargo. The United States first aided Israel by flying in arms and ammunition to the country on October 14th in Operation Nickel Grass. In response to this action and support of Israel from other oil-consuming countries, the OPEC ministers decided on a price increase from $3 to $5 per barrel on October 16th, and then agreed to reduce oil production rates by 5% in each oil-consuming country, and continue decreasing by 5% each month that support for Israel continued. OPEC would eventually raise the price of oil from $5 per barrel to $11.65, damaging the global economy.
We do not wish to place any restrictions on our oil exports to the United States, but as I mentioned, America's complete support of Zionism against the Arabs makes it extremely difficult for us to continue to supply the United States petroleum needs.
In this crisis, as we have in other crises, not hesitate to take a firm stand.
Although U.S. President Richard Nixon was aware of the Arab country's oil weapon, he took a stand against OPEC and gave support to Israel despite the possible consequences. When Nixon proposed to give a $2.2 billion aid package to Israel, the Arab petroleum producers on October 17, 1973, announced a complete embargo on all shipments to the United States. The major oil companies in the U.S., Exxon, Mobil, Texaco, and Standard Oil of California, agreed to stop shipments to embargoed countries, so that there could be future business with Arab countries. These major oil companies had little to no power in decisions regarding the export of oil because they drilled for oil on OPEC land. Some companies tried to convince the government to agree with the terms of Arab nations in order to regain a full supply of oil. Quote, "There must be understanding on our part of the aspirations of the Arab people and more positive support of their efforts towards peace in the Middle East." Standard Oil Company of California. Despite their efforts, the embargo continued for 5 months and affected the everyday life of people across the United States. Most United States citizens were unaware of how dependent they were on foreign oil. With just 10% of imported oil reduced, 500,000 jobs were lost. When the embargo was put in place, gas prices rose 400%, from 30 cents to $1.20. At first, many believed the major oil companies in the U.S. were behind the gas shortages, so they could raise the price of oil. Without the oil from the Arab nations, the United States had to turn to new conservation methods.
The amount of gasoline which refiners distribute to wholesalers and retailers will be reduced across the nation by 15%. I am asking tonight that all gasoline filling stations close down their pumps between 9 p.m. Saturday night and midnight Sunday every weekend, beginning December 1. Therefore, the third step will be the establishment of a maximum speed limit for automobiles of 50 miles per hour nationwide.
In some states, people with even number license plates could only buy gas on the even days of the month and odd license plates for the odd days. President Nixon, in a time when his approval ratings fell below 30%, introduced Project Independence to combat the energy crisis.
This means we will hold our fate and our future in our hands
The project
alone.
called for new forms of conservation, development of new domestic energy sources, and research with respect to energy, with a goal to be independent from foreign oil by 1980. Project Independence was unsuccessful because it called on the will of the public instead of strict laws, and the goals for development from research were unrealistic.
Energy. Sometimes I think I'm running out of energy.
The United States fell deeper into crisis. There was controversy on how the U.S. should continue to take a stand. James Schlesinger, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, argued that the United States should consider military seizure of oil fields to guarantee the flow of oil. The Arab countries responded by threatening to blow up their oil reserves if U.S. attempted to occupy. Reports in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia claimed mines were planted and oil fields were wired. The U.S. Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, quote, persuaded Nixon to ignore Schlesinger's advice and allow him to begin a large-scale resupply of Israel, end quote. The United States took a stand by continuing to support Israel without engaging their troops. The production decrease and price increase affected the Western world. President Nixon and Henry Kissinger invited the foreign ministers of 8 oil-consuming countries, Britain, France, Canada, Italy, Japan, Netherlands, Norway, and West Germany, to create a multinational long-term agreement regarding the energy situation. On February 13, 1974, Henry Kissinger submitted a 7-point program that would be the base of the oil consumers' actions. It called for the oil consumers to work together in conservation research, aid one another in times of shortages, and formulate a response to the producers to find a just price of oil. The United States eventually began to change their policy towards efforts to help create Israeli-Egyptian disengagement, which is what the Arab countries had requested. The embargo was lifted on March 18, 1974, which the Arab countries called for due to a change in U.S. policy towards Israel and the U.S. support for disengagement. The stand that the U.S. took to support Israel was successful in that Israel was the military victor of the Yom Kippur War. However, the international power that the embargo gave OPEC made Egypt, Syria, and the Arab states political victors. The embargo created a wealth transfer for OPEC from $23 billion in 1973 to $110 billion by 1975, and marked the first time OPEC had the power to control the posted price of oil. To prevent the renewal of an embargo and surrender to the power of OPEC, many countries changed their foreign policies to focus on peace in the Middle East. In the 1980s, OPEC's power substantially weakened when the international oil demand decreased and crude oil resources were found in other countries, creating competition for the posted price of oil. The energy crisis would continue throughout the 1970s. However, the oil embargo was not the main cause of it. The growing energy demand, lack of conservation efforts, inappropriate government policies, and lack of a solution in coal, solar, nuclear, or natural gas energy created the energy crisis. The energy crisis had been predicted before the threat of the embargo and lasted many years after it. The Energy Policy and Conservation Act was created in 1975. Within it was a plan for a large reserve of emergency oil called the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, today the largest emergency supply in the world. Today, 12.9% of imported oil to the U.S. is from the Persian Gulf region.